So thank you everyone for coming. This has been a great turnout despite this miserable deluge of water that's going on outside. But thank you for coming out yet again and sponsoring our natural disasters event. So our last talk is by Megan Arnold.
I didn't get that.
Okay, she is going to talk about after disaster strikes, economic impacts from natural disasters and how modeling technologies help institutions prepare. So Megan, she received her bachelor's degree at Bates College in Maine, where she focused on paleoclimatology research using glacial-like sediments from the high Arctic region of Svalbard. Megan is currently working as a geologist and catastrophe modeler at Risk Management Solutions, a company that aims to create a more sustainable global society through a better understanding of catastrophic events. So at RMS, she manages catastrophic risk assessment for earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, and other perils across the globe. So I'm looking forward to seeing this talk kind of bringing together all the themes that we talked about today. So please join me in welcoming Megan Arnold.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here and talk about a topic that I'm really passionate about. Listening earlier to, oh, is it on?
The bottom one.
Oh, no. Thank you. All right. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay. So I sat in on the last half of Ross's talk and also on Vadim's, and there are some interesting elements there that commonalities with me. So I also lived in Redwood City for 5 years when I was in California and felt my first earthquake when I was living out there. And I'm also a born and raised Vermonter. So I was not aware that we have a hot blob that's rising up my very idyllic small town home state. But now I know, and I wish my family was a little further south because I'd offer their properties up to Vadim for his seismic sensors. So before I get into all of this topic about thinking about financial losses from catastrophes, I wanted to ask you all if any of you have ever heard of a CAT model before. Okay, I see Ross, I see Sam, and I know what you all might be thinking. You're probably thinking this comes up to mind first, some felines and some ridiculous outfits, or maybe just one that looks particularly handsome like the one on the left. He's mine. I've had him for 2 weeks. And so while these are some CAT models, the models that I'm talking about are catastrophic risk models, disaster models, and maybe the only disaster here is their fashion choices. So CAT models are used as tools to estimate potential losses from catastrophic events. And so the first thing that comes to mind with catastrophic events when you're thinking about how do I start estimating this, a lot of people will start looking at the historical record. And Ross went into some of this. Like when you think about the 1906 earthquake, the historical record only goes back 75 years prior to that event. And so if you're looking at a historical record along the whole timeline, you might think that there are a lot of events happening in recent times and maybe not as much in the past. So if we go through some historical events in the past, we have an earthquake in central Italy, large earthquake in China, and around this time, people were starting to writing things down, and humans didn't live everywhere they live today. And one interesting one was the Pacific Northwest earthquake in 1700. So the first evidence of this earthquake was in Japan, and Japan has an excellent record of earthquakes and tsunami. And the two usually go together. There's an earthquake, then there's a tsunami. Or there's tsunami that usually happened after an earthquake. But in 1700, there was this ghost tsunami that came without an earthquake. And it wasn't until recent years that there were researchers in the Pacific Northwest coring some peat out by the coastline, and they discovered a layer of sand. And with some carbon-14 dating, they also embarked on an anthropological study talking to the native tribes in that area, and they were able to discern that that was where the tsunami in Japan originated. So we estimate that was a magnitude 9 earthquake off the coast of, I believe it was Oregon. And so As we get into more recent years, like in 1755, these two earthquakes occurred in places you don't typically have earthquakes nowadays. So 1755 in Portugal, there was an earthquake and a tsunami, and 2 weeks later, there was a magnitude 7 in Cape Ann, Massachusetts. You wouldn't think that a magnitude 7-ish would happen in Massachusetts, but they do. And Ross had also talked a bit about the New Madrid earthquakes in the 1800s. And there were some other earthquakes in Japan, San Francisco 1906. As you get into more recent years, these earthquakes you feel like they're increasing in size and frequency. But that's not quite reality. It's more that humans have populated this earth now more in places than they have before. We have instruments all over the country. You saw in Vadim's presentation how they put out seismic instruments across our continent. And so there's so much more instrumentation nowadays that we're able to more accurately understand when these events are happening and how big. But if you rely on the historical record, sorry, I need to step back a second. So one of the uses for catastrophe models is with the insurance industry. So the insurance industry wants to understand catastrophic risk. And the time that the insurance industry has been around has really been the last 300 years. So if they're looking at a historical record of the last 300 years, would that really represent the future? Could you really extrapolate that? And that's where CAT models come into play, because large earthquakes occur infrequently, exposures are constantly changing, CAT models are probabilistic. They go beyond the historical record to think about what could potentially happen in the future. Like just because we don't have a historical record of a magnitude 7 earthquake occurring in New Jersey, does that mean that it's never going to happen in the future? Probably not. It possibly could, but it would be a very low probability, but it could. And so CAT modeling really helps with going beyond what we've known to date. And this industry really started up in the late 80s, early 90s. There were two folks who were attributed with developing some of the first CAT models. One was Karen Clark, based out of Boston. She built a hurricane model. And then the other one was Hemant Shah at Stanford. He created an earthquake model as part of his master's in engineering project. And he founded RMS, that's the company that I work for. So you'll probably hear me talk about him a little bit more than Karen Clark. She founded AIR Worldwide, which is our main competitor. So I might not be talking about her as much. So there were a few events that happened in the late 80s, early 90s that really got this industry of CAT modeling going. And so I'm going to ask you all, do you remember 1989, the World Series, San Francisco Giants versus the Oakland A's, Game 3, what happened? The Loma Prieta earthquake. So this event happened at 5:04 p.m., which is rush hour on any other day in the Bay Area, but this happened to be the big battle between two of the local teams, so most people left work early to go home, sit at their TVs to watch the game. And this was a magnitude 6.9 on the San Andreas Fault. This event caused $6 billion in economic losses and $900 million in insured losses. And there were 63 deaths. But had this earthquake occur on any other normal day, that death toll probably would have been much higher, because there was a lot of damage to infrastructure. This is the Cypress Viaduct. This is a double level highway that collapsed. And also the Bay Bridge had a collapse of one of its spans. So had this been on any other normal rush hour, the loss of life would have probably been much more significant. And so being at RMS, we typically say that this event was the true test to Hemant Shah's earthquake model. And so around this time, Hemant and Karen Clark were going out to insurance companies saying, you should use this. You should use CAT models. These are useful tools. And for Karen Clark's benefit, in 1992, her model was really tested by Hurricane Andrew. And this event really shook up the whole industry, to be honest. This was a Category 5 hurricane making landfall in Miami-Dade County. Right now there's a lot of homes and exposure down there. That's one of the big population centers of Florida. And this event had winds that were topping 165 miles an hour right before it made landfall. And this caused about $25 to $34 billion in economic damage, $15 billion in insured loss. That is the largest loss in the US at that time. And then you take a sip. And so 25,000 homes were destroyed. And you think about an image like this. This is a whole neighborhood that the hurricane passed over. And there were over 100,000 homes that were damaged. And most of these homes had insurance, but this rocked the insurance industry so much that 11 companies went insolvent. 11 companies could not pay out their claims to their clients, their customers. And that's a big concern to insurance companies. So they had a lot of lessons to learn from Hurricane Andrew. And this was another event that the main two founders of cat modeling went out to insurance companies saying, you need our tools. You need to use this because you need to be better prepared for the next disaster. And the next one in the US was Northridge earthquake. This was in 1994. This was a magnitude 6.9 on a blind thrust fault. So blind thrust, the word blind means that the fault is not exposed at the surface. So it's covered by sediment and soil and quaternary fill. So you don't know that that fault exists. And so people were surprised, like, oh, there's an earthquake happening on a fault that I don't know about. And that's something that cat models can account for. We do think about the active faults that everybody is aware of, but we also think about, we call it background seismicity. So what about the areas where you don't know if there's a fault? You could still have some seismic potential there. And this event was about on par with Hurricane Andrew, with about $50 billion in economic damage, $15 billion in insured losses, and this also had significant damage to infrastructure and to other structures as well. And when I was putting this together, I was thinking about a number of earthquakes in California and how we've actually really lucked out over the past few decades, because Loma Prieta happened during the ball game, Northridge happened at 4:30 in the morning, so before the crazy LA commute. One earthquake that I experienced in the Bay Area was the Napa Valley earthquake, and that happened the day, like right before or after a festival, and that happened in the early morning hours. So if you have people out and around during an earthquake, it's like you could have the falling bricks, you could have your roads giving way, and there can be a lot of damage and loss of life if people are out. So we've actually been really lucky that with the timing that these earthquakes have occurred. And so before I get further into cat modeling and what they are and how they're used, I want to talk about who we are. Who are the people that build cat models? And so one area are earth scientists. So that's like the folks like Ross and Vadim that you heard today, the experts in seismology, geophysics, geology, and also in climate. So thinking about meteorology, hydrology, atmospheric science, people who know tornadoes and hail and hurricanes and wildfires. So these are all the folks who are assessing the natural hazard of an area. And then we also need engineers to think about how a building will respond. So you crawl back to Ross's presentation with those two diagrams of houses. So engineers study those and they create damage functions. They create calculations for you to assess how resistant a building is to a natural force, to ground shaking or to wind. And there are also other types of engineers that have overlaps, like geotechnical engineers, software engineers. But we also need some people with mathematics and statistics background. A lot of insurance companies have actuaries, and so that's an area where they do very heavy statistics. We need people who know computer science because they need to hook up all of these models within a model and all of the systems to actually be used and into a usable way. And so we also need people with finance and economic backgrounds to think about the impact of these events, and businesses to think about what types of products they need to be writing, what types of insurance policies will be useful to the community. And one of the really cool things about these CAT modelers is that they don't only exist at companies like mine and AIR Worldwide. A lot of the large insurance companies have their own CAT modeling departments now. And that was one of the things that came out of those early 90s events, was that they decided we need to better understand this risk, we need to do better, and they've created whole teams around these CAT modeling. So for the students in the room and for the parents who have students in any of these fields, the insurance industry is a really great way to apply any type of this background. And it makes a big difference, not only business-wise, but society-wise, because the more people that have insurance, after a bad event, more likely you'll be able to get your payout and rebuild and make your community more resilient. So now that I've covered who we are, I want to get into how a CAT model works. And so these are the 5 main pieces, the framework to a CAT model. And this is the RMS perspective. AIR Worldwide probably they have a different flavor of this. And I'm going to walk through each one of these. And so first off, I'm going to start with stochastic events. I'm going to use earthquakes since this is a geology open house as an example. For stochastic events, we first need to create a set of earthquake events and their associated probabilities. And so first step is thinking about, where do earthquakes occur? They typically occur at active tectonic areas. So you can have your subduction zones, your transform faults. You can have them on just also other types of faults that are not right on that heavily active area. And we call that background seismicity. So those are smaller events that happen on unidentified sources. Subduction zone sources tend to produce the larger earthquakes. Strike slip faults tend to produce moderately sized earthquakes, and other faults are generally a bit lower in size. And here, I want to see if this is, oh no, that's not going to work. So the other thing that we do is characterize event size. And this was a little video that I pulled off of YouTube because I wanted to show how, give you a scale. Like Ross said, you would need 1,000 magnitude 6s to produce a magnitude 8. So here, this is the event in Haiti that was a magnitude 7. And then that big one, that big circle, is the 9.5 earthquake, the largest ever recorded earthquake, which is 1960 in Chile. And so that's one way to think about the difference in magnitude of events. And we need to think about those in our CAT models. So we think about the size of the event and how frequently that event will occur. So we're probably not going to get very many magnitude 9s year over year, but we'll probably get quite a bit more magnitude 7s, a lot more magnitude 6s, and a lot more magnitude 5s. And so this is another way to think about it. And oh yeah, this is a better image there. And so when we have our event set, we need to think about the type of hazard. And you can have an earthquake, but what makes an earthquake hazardous is the ground shaking. So that's our hazard for earthquakes. We have to calculate the ground motion of each event across the modeled area. And there's regional variations to ground motion. So this is a great diagram here of 2 earthquakes that were approximately the same size that are historical events. You have the magnitude 7.8 1906 earthquake here in California, and this is our estimation of how far that ground motion had traveled. And it didn't really make it past the California border. This over here was a magnitude 7.6 from the New Madrid earthquake, and that was felt all across the entire eastern US, all the way up into Canada, into New Brunswick. And there are stories that there were bells tolling from that earthquake in the Northeast. And the way that these ground motions, why they're so different, is because of the age, temperature, and type of crust. So you crawl back to Vadim's presentation, and he had shown those pictures of like the different temperatures of the crust. The eastern part of the country is much older than the western part of the country, so our crust is colder and more brittle. And so ground motion waves decay at a much slower rate on the east coast than they do at the west coast. And another interesting one here, do you all remember the 2011 earthquake that happened in Virginia? Did any of you feel it up here? All right, I was living in California at the time. I was really bummed that I missed an East Coast earthquake. My building, my office building, is in Hoboken, New Jersey, and they actually had to evacuate it. It's 13 floors tall, everybody had to go out, and they were all just really surprised that there was an earthquake that we could feel, and that was all the way down in Virginia. And so this is a diagram of the Did You Feel It feature on the USGS. So you can go on, when you feel an earthquake, you can log on to the USGS and you can report, I felt this, and this is what the shaking felt like. So this is showing all the dots are where people reported weak shaking. And there was an 2004 earthquake in Central California that was a similar magnitude. And it's really limited to just the state of California. The waves do not travel, ground motion waves do not travel very far outside of, they attenuate much faster on the west coast. And so this is what we do as CAT modelers. We think about the relationship of the ground motion decay, and we use calculations called ground motion prediction equations. And so this is a shake map from the USGS. And so this is the observed ground shaking. This is the peak ground acceleration. And then we use that to calibrate our model. So this is our modeled output for that event. And so we want to make comparisons to ensure that our modeled ground motion is valid and realistic, like we see in observed data. All right, so we've covered stochastic events, event hazard, now we're applying exposure. So exposure is anything that can be damaged by a natural disaster event. So this can be, often we think about buildings. It's often what's inside of your buildings, your contents. Your contents are often the things that are damaged first, like your TVs. Those can just topple over during an earthquake. And also, buildings, contents. So that's just like your whole, like whatever could be damaged by an earthquake. And there are quite a few questions that you want to know about exposure. You want to know where it is. You want to know, what does the building contain? Is this a family residence? Is this an apartment building? Is it a school? You want to know what the construction material is, because brick is going to behave a whole lot differently from wood frame homes during an earthquake. You want to know how tall it is, because if you think about building height, tall buildings are actually flexible and they have their own period, and so you need to consider that because they'll respond to earthquakes differently from a two-story building. You want to know how old the building is. This is a whole area that I could get into about building codes. The building codes in California change after nearly every single earthquake, and because you learn new things from every event that happens. So building age is very important. And then also, what are the coverages? So your insurance coverage could be for the building, it could be for your contents, and it could also be business interruption. Business interruption is essentially the downtime for a business because they can't get into the building. But it also, for you as homeowners, we call that additional living expenses. So if you cannot get into your home after a disaster, you cannot occupy it, you can have a clause in your insurance policy that will pay you back for staying in a hotel while your home is being repaired. So that's something you can check out to see if you have, is coverage for ALE, additional living expenses. So I'm going to use the Rutgers Geology Museum as an example. So where is the building? The building is right across the street on Somerset Street. What does it contain? It's a museum. So they would also want to have very high contents coverage since they have very delicate and valuable specimens. What is the building made of? I've only seen it from the outside, so I'm going to guess masonry, stone masonry, but knowing that this is a university, maybe that's been retrofitted, but I don't know from just looking at the outside. How tall is it? It looks to be 3 stories. And how old is it? I looked online and it looks to be about 140 years old. So this is all really important information that goes into the model, because the next step is to think about the damage. So you need to know what your building is in order to know how that's going to respond to ground shaking. And so this module is, we call it the vulnerability piece, because you want to know how vulnerable something is to whatever hazard you're exposing it to. So for hurricanes, that would be wind. For flood, that would be water depth. For tornado and hail, that's also wind and a little different. So these are some pictures that I took with my colleagues for the very first earthquake I ever felt, the 2014 Napa Valley earthquake. It was a magnitude 6. I felt it in Redwood City. It woke me up in the middle of the night. I was like, oh man, this is it, finally an earthquake. It was a geologist's dream come true, and I hope I never feel one again. That was enough. It was a magnitude 6 and I was about 50 miles away. So you think about damage. Damage can be rather light. Like here, this is a picture of a house that lost its chimney. And you remember the 2011 earthquake? That caused quite a bit of chimney failure in Virginia. So that's a typical failure for houses that have chimneys. But that's a relatively low type of damage. Next level might be losing your facade. So this building is one of the oldest buildings in Napa. The structure of the building remained pretty much intact, but it lost the stone facade on the outside. So this was not a 100% damage building. Neither was this one, which it was a reinforced masonry that lost the top corner. And I looked on Google Street Maps. The building's still there, it's been repaired, and still houses the business, Carpe Diem Wine Bar. But then this house down here is probably 100% damage. It's come off of its foundation, it's out of plumb, the building has started to tear apart. This would need to be completely torn down and rebuilt. So this is a total loss. So here we have moderate loss to total loss. And for CAT models, we have to think about all of that. And another area we consider, and I'm going to shift gears a little bit here, is mitigation. So for earthquake, you can retrofit your homes, like Ross explained, adding those supports at the corners. That can make a really big difference for earthquakes. For hurricanes and floods, it's raising your home up on stilts. So that's why whenever you go to the beach, Jersey Shore or elsewhere, you often see houses up on stilts so that they are above the expected water line. And so this is an example of this house had a lot of publicity after Hurricane Michael, which was a Cat 4. And this house is on the Florida Panhandle. It's really the only one that's standing out of this neighborhood of Mexico Beach. And they got a lot of press for this, and I have a link to the New York Times article. And so these homeowners decided that they wanted to build a house that would withstand the big one. And they just didn't realize that the big one was happening so soon. But they built their house to above code, meaning that the wind code in the Panhandle is about, you have to build your house to withstand 120 to 150 mile an hour winds. They built it to withstand 250. And so there are small things that you can do to better prepare your home for an event. If you have your home on the coast, it could be using impact-resistant glass. If you're rebuilding a home, it could be making those adjustments to make it more resilient and withstand the different types of hazards that you could be exposed to. And so the final step to how a CAT model works is determining the financial impact. And so this is calculating the financial loss from the physical damage to the property. And then if we're an insurance company, also thinking about how much me as an insurance company has to pay you as your policyholders. So I have this little example here. Let's think of your house. Your replacement cost value, this isn't not necessarily market value, that tends to fluctuate. Your replacement cost value to rebuild your house is $500,000. You have a 10% deductible of $50K, so your covered limit is $450K. So that's how much you're covered for by your insurance policy. And you're paying $10,000 annually in premium. I'm not a homeowner, so I don't know how realistic this is. I have renter's insurance. But this is what I'm going to use as an example. And so if I'm an insurance company and I write this exact policy for 100 homes, I am now, my homeowner's book is 50 million of total insured value. And I am exposed to 45 million. That's how much I am on the hook to pay out. And if I collected $10,000 per premium, I've got $10 million in my pocket from what you all paid me. Now, if one home is a total loss due to a house fire, then that's a $400K payout I have to give to one of you. And so I'm doing pretty well. But if this is a year where there are 20 homes that have a total loss, that's $9 million. And that's a little scary, because then I'm on the hook for 90% of the premium that I've earned. And while this is a schematic example of computing financial loss, this type of concentrated loss is actually a real thing. This is what happened in Hurricane Andrew. And then this is also what happened in Coffey Park during the 2017 wildfires in the Santa Rosa, Napa Valley area. The fire jumped a highway and sparked the fire in this neighborhood, and within hours, 1,400 homes had been burnt down, complete loss. And so if I was an insurer and I was insuring 100 homes here, if my book was in this 1,500 house neighborhood, I would have been out of business, probably. So insurance companies need to think about diversifying their risk, but also really being aware of where their concentrations are. There was a insurance company in during the Palisade fire that they also went insolvent because they only wrote in that area. So these are all things that insurance companies have to consider. So these are some headlines from the Insurance Journal from the wildfire events. And so during an event, insurance companies will start embarking on the claims process, sending out adjusters, claims agents, working with their clients to determine how much damage happened to their home and their payout. But these companies are often publicly traded. So they're also at the same time trying to figure out how much money are we going to lose. And that often affects their stock price. So this starts getting into some more of the economical areas that I'm not going to really touch on. But these are some headlines that all of the cat modeling companies like my own, we're all trying to estimate how much damage this event could have produced. So there's often headlines here of this cat model vendor, this is actually ours. We estimate the insured losses to be at $9 billion to $13 billion. But our competitors, AIR Worldwide, other cat modelers, are putting out their own estimates too. So you might often see in the news, CNN with their running daily headlines, like some of these could like flash up and become headline news. And then insurance companies will also report their losses from these events. So Allstate lost $670 million. Farmers expects $2.1 billion in claims. They might not be on the hook for all of that. But that's what they expected to come in for claims. And Allstate also reported that their shares fell 11% due to those wildfires. And so this event was a really big deal in the insurance industry, the 2017 fires. And so there was a lot of press about this. There was a lot of press about PG&E, but I'm not going to get too far into that. So this is the general framework. And if we shift back into thinking about earthquakes, there are other hazards there that's not just ground shaking. So one is liquefaction. That's when your ground starts behaving like a liquid and it loses its stability. So your houses can sink, you can have water expelled, you can just have sediment covered everywhere. So this was the 2010-2011 New Zealand earthquakes. And there was a series of events that happened over a year. And this was the first one in September. This was the Darfield earthquake. This produced quite a bit of land damage in Christchurch. And then several months later was the February 2011 event, and this caused widespread liquefaction damage. And so this was a very big deal to the area. These events in total caused $30 billion US dollars of loss in New Zealand, which is about 20% of their GDP. So this was a really big deal to New Zealand. There were areas where the government went in and said, nobody can rebuild here, it's too dangerous. So the government bought out people's homes, saying, we'll pay you, but you can't rebuild. You have to go somewhere else. So this was a very big deal, and these are some pictures of the liquefaction. So this is all water. You can see that this is sediment here and sediment here. These were our company, sends people to the large disasters to do reconnaissance. So these were pictures that, aside from the top one, that my colleagues had taken when they were able to get access to the New Zealand area. Another earthquake hazard that's not ground shaking are tsunamis. And I had touched on that earlier. And this one, tsunamis can produce widespread damage very quickly. And so I have a couple images here from the Chile earthquake. This was an aerial image of the neighborhood in Chile, and this was after the tsunami came. And so this is, when there's a tsunami, your house is often going to get 100% damage. And so these are things that as CAT modelers we need to consider. And there are also other elements here too. This was, in 2014, I was in Anchorage, Alaska, and they were having an anniversary of the Great Alaskan Earthquake of 1964. This was the largest earthquake that has happened in the US. It was a magnitude 9.2. And there was significant damage from liquefaction, ground shaking, and also tsunami. And as part of this museum exhibit, they showed pictures that the teachers, so the tsunami hit Seward and Homer, and when people were able to leave their homes, try and regroup, teachers took the kids into school. They were like, we need to start school right away. We need to get these kids a sense of normalcy. And this was an extremely traumatic event for the children. So they gave the kids crayons and paper and they said, draw. Drawing is often a therapeutic way of dealing with trauma. And these were the images that some children drew. So with this event, first wave comes in to this area of Alaska, damages oil tankers, oil pipelines, and then the waters go out. And then when they come back, that oil is on fire. So not only was this a water tsunami, it was also on fire. And so that's a really, it's still crazy for me to believe it. But that was like a human element to this tsunami that just made it all the more frightening and terrifying. You can see from these drawings of boats on fire, of these black waves coming in. And so these communities rebuilt. There were some that were abandoned in Alaska, but these were eventually rebuilt. And so this is why CAT modeling is so important. It's when we think about present day, we think about how as humans we have expanded our area of coverage to places that haven't really been occupied before. And so we have more exposure, we have more expensive homes, more expensive materials. And so if there's a catastrophic event, that's going to mean more loss. And so the historical record is not complete, so we should use CAT models to supplement it. We should think about events that could potentially happen rather than just events that have happened. And these models provide a representation of the complex physical phenomena of liquefaction, of tsunami, of ground shaking, of wind, of flooding, and allows for the calculation of expected loss from these types of events. And we also provide a lot of uncertainty or quantify the uncertainty in the results. And the insurance industry is not just you pay your insurance company to cover you for your policy. There's a whole marketplace where insurance companies transfer their risk to other entities, and there are brokers, there are reinsurers, there are even catastrophe bonds that hedge funds are now channeling funds into. So there's a whole marketplace that uses CAT models because it's a common framework for expressing this risk. And it can be used as a currency around this industry of transferring and transferring the risk that an insurer is covering for you. And so over time, we're finding that CAT losses are growing. This is a report from the Swiss Re Institute. This can be downloaded online, so if you're interested, you can download this. This was from 2018. So every year, Swiss Re will publish a Sigma report where they're recapping all the events from the year. And so they've been keeping track of the catastrophe losses since 1970. And the dark blue is earthquake and tsunami losses. The light blue are weather-related events, so that would be like hurricanes, tornadoes. And then the green are man-made disasters. So not only could catastrophes be the natural hazards, but also man-made. So if you see for 2001, this is the largest man-made disaster, and that was 9/11. So that had a lot of insured losses from that event. And the general trend is that CAT losses are increasing. There's a really big spike here with these years. So number 5 were hurricanes Katrina, Rita, and Wilma. Those 3 events occurring in that same year in a few different places produced a lot of loss in our own country. And then number 7 here was 2011. That was the Japan Tohoku earthquake, the New Zealand earthquakes, the floods in Thailand, as well as that year also had a lot of tornado losses from the central US. And then number 9 were also hurricane-based. This was hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. So Hurricane Harvey in Texas, Irma, which impacted the Caribbean and Florida, and Maria, which was also pretty much just the Caribbean. And this is just the insured loss perspective. Economic losses are also growing, and with it, so here, the dark blue is insured losses, the light blue is uninsured. So with these losses growing over time, the gap, we call it the protection gap, is also growing. Protection gap means the difference between the losses that are covered by insurance companies and then the total loss of the event. So losses are increasing, but less people have the coverage that they need to rebuild and repair their homes. And so this is a challenge that the insurance industry is trying to face. We're trying to think about how to close this gap, how to be better stewards to our communities, to make our communities more resilient. And so there are some things that you can do, because I don't want to just give you all the dire and scary stuff, but also some things that you can do yourselves. One would be, do you have adequate coverage for your home? Think about, will your limit cover the cost to repair or rebuild your home? So not just thinking about your home value, but to rebuild it. Do you have coverage for additional living expenses? That could also be really helpful for you to add to your policy. And in New Jersey, we're not really at a big risk for earthquakes, but we are a big risk for flooding. A lot of you probably experienced Hurricane Sandy, and New Jersey has quite a lot of rivers as well. So there are most banks that provide mortgages, they often require that you have flood insurance, but they're not often always checking up on it. So some homeowners start lapsing in their flood insurance because they're not required to report it again. So that's something to look into. And there are a couple websites like Trembler that Ross has for earthquake risk. You can look at FEMA.gov or njfloodmapper.org, and these can give you some idea of the flood hazard in your area. So you can assess, do you need flood insurance? That might be something to add on to your insurance coverage. And you also don't have to get your flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program. There are more and more private insurance companies that are offering flood coverage, and you can also add those on top of your NFIP coverage to make sure that you're covering the total value of your home. And so with that, that's my call to action to you. And the next one is, do you have any questions about CAT models or anything here? I finished on time, so I'm very excited about that. Yes.
Thank you. Lovely presentation.
Oh, thanks.
I want to step back a little bit and scale. So there is you and your colleagues in the modeling science and industry giving input to the insurance industry as to where to move from here now that we're habitating every coast and every mountain on the planet. But where are we from your desk with regulations, state, federal, and regional? Lots of towns are interested in when their local economy collapses because of these strikes.
Yep.
I see more regulation coming in to regulate the insurance companies to say, you can't say, no, I won't cover this. Is this true?
That is very true. So one big thing recently that's happened is in California, the regulators have told insurance companies, you cannot cancel, you cannot exclude wildfire from your policies. So insurance companies that write homeowners have to cover wildfire. And regulators have said you cannot increase your rates. You cannot increase the price of insurance. Or I think that's quite right. I can't quite remember, but regulators after events, they do make...
You can't gouge prices after events.
Right, so regulators are trying to protect the consumers to make sure that people can get coverage. There are times where, like after the Northridge earthquake, a lot of insurance companies started excluding earthquake coverage. So California created the California Earthquake Authority, a separate entity to offer earthquake coverage to their residents. But it's very expensive. It's about a 15% deductible. So that's a relatively high deductible. It's expensive to buy a policy. And while it is available, and every time you talk to an insurance agent, they're supposed to ask you if you want it. I think it's about 15% of homeowners in California actually have coverage for earthquake. So regulators do get very involved after events. They do want to protect the consumers and make sure that people can afford insurance. But there are a lot of politics around that as well.
Where's it going in the next 50 years? That's part of the question. Where's the regulation going in the next? Just take a good guess.
Oh.
Are they going to be more involved? Are they going to be hybrid programs where private industry and the government serves the consumer?
I think probably what would be most sustainable would be a hybrid. And that's what the insurance industry is really trying to push for flood insurance-wise. So the NFIP is heavily in debt, and we think that having more privatized elements of flood coverage could benefit consumers. And so the NFIP, but that's also a very political, highly hot topic that a lot of our politicians don't want to touch right now. They have other things on their minds. And so that's something that I think we do, as an industry, we typically do want to be more involved. And there was a big, in one of the recent renewals of the NFIP program, they have allowed non-compete. They've excluded non-compete. So they are allowing people that write NFIP coverage on behalf of the federal government, they can also have their own policies that they can add on to it. Yeah.
So I get two questions. Well, one of them is pretty simple, and one of them is less simple.
Okay.
You were shown the chart on the various losses, man-made versus natural. What would you categorize something like Fukushima where it's a mix?
Yeah, that is a mix. So that's the 2011 bucket. I think this is number 7. Yeah, so Fukushima itself. So that there's kind of it was like a sequence. You had the earthquake, you have the tsunami, and then this facility was damaged. So that's not necessarily a man-made disaster. We might consider that more like a super cat. So a super cat is a super catastrophe. So some recent super cats was like Fukushima, where you had this sequential of events that have made really drastic increased losses significantly, as well as Hurricane Katrina. So that was where you had the levees fail, you had like oil spills, chemical contamination, people could not get back to their homes within a reasonable time. So Hurricane Katrina was also a super cat.
So in the second question, so that I see that because I could see somebody arguing liability of their directional, but has anybody tried to use or game any of these models for financial advantage? We were reading this story about some of the countries cheating some of the European governments for taxes. I could see somebody trying to use one of the CAT models to gain a financial advantage, like either influencing them or something like that. Has any of that? Anybody's concerned that the modeling itself could be used to influence financial instruments?
Cat bonds.
Yeah, cat bonds. I haven't really quite heard of some like nefarious activity. There was a situation where there was a lawsuit for a cat bond, because for catastrophe bonds, this is a investment mechanism for to cover huge exposures, huge books. And there's a company that helps place the cat bonds. So my company is one. We have a few competitors that also do it. And there was an instance where the mechanism for the payout would be based on a loss value derived from a separate company. The company that placed the cat bond and the company that sets that loss value for the event are owned by the same parent company. And there was an incident where the company setting the loss value had changed the number, so that triggered the cat bond. That then so the people paying out the cat bond said, well, you changed that number. You were doing this like for your own gain rather than for to help us. Like you were rigging the system. That's the only incident that I'm aware of. But insurance companies do use catastrophe models as a way to be competitive. So they have a competitive advantage over, and they have their own secret sauce. Companies will do their own blending, they'll have their own models, they have their own view, and they're like, this is our secret sauce. This is gonna make us better and more profitable than all these other companies here. So that piece of competitiveness is very prevalent, but that's not really rigging the system to have a nefarious financial gain.
Why isn't the insurance industry lobbying the government over climate change to reduce their exposure the way they used to do for seat belts and airbags in automobiles?
So I think with climate change, insurance companies are definitely really thinking about it. They're hiring people internally to, like boards and CEOs are like, we need somebody to think about climate change. We're hiring people here. I think we're just not quite at that point just yet because this is my own personal opinion. I feel like the real impacts with climate change politically are going to happen when there's financial elements to it. And insurance companies will be at the front line for that because they're going to be on the hook for paying out losses due to large events. I think with the wildfires in California, the wildfires in Australia, we are starting to get to that tipping point, but I think we're just not quite there yet in the eyes of the people to make these decisions to say this was definitely climate change. I think we're getting there, we're not quite there yet. Ross.
Yeah. Make a comment on that. I sit on the catastrophe board of Zurich Insurance, and Zurich is one of the world's largest primary insurers, and they're basically under attack by people who want them not to provide insurance to coal plants. Now, when you think about it, insurance companies have enormous power, because if they don't insure coal plants, coal dies. So they have the power. They don't actually even have to go to the government. They control the finances of all power generation. But they're reluctant to do it because they would leave some money on the table. But they are wrestling with this. They're worried about climate change, and they have enormous power to change the economics around the situation.
But we're looking at that chart, and their exposure and their outlays are growing and growing, and a lot of those are environmental disasters.
Mm-hmm.
So their reaction is to raise rates to cover that growth. But just raising rates doesn't actually change the situation. The situation changes if they stop providing insurance to producers of carbon. Then they become an agent of change, not just reactive.
And I think, as Ross said, we're getting close. We're getting closer to that tipping point.
If you're following that, I didn't know about that, the coal industry. But there's been a problem with coastal building, residential building on the coastlines of North America, and because of global warming, sea level rise, increased storms, that it's a natural, I teach a course some of this in it, and it's a natural process, and should we buy out land, should we retreat a city away from the coast? The insurance does it automatically. Yeah, we'll insure you. You have to pay 10 times what you used to pay, because we have to rebuild your house every 4 years. And if you can't pay that, then you withdraw. So economically, it pushes catastrophic location in this case, pushes people out without the government having to intervene.
There's a saying with Florida that Florida has it's called a slab market, along slab market. So when we call a slab when a home structure is swept away and all that's left is the concrete slab foundation. So after a storm, people will come in, they'll be like, oh, hey, I can rebuild here. This will be great. There's not going to be another storm to come here for a long time. And yet another one comes in. I'm finding that local governments are tackling more of the climate change issues and this resilient issue head on, whereas our federal government is just right now, they're not doing anything in this area, but local governments definitely are. There have been a number of programs I've been involved in. One is called 100 Resilient Cities. There's Risky Business. So these are kind of foundations that are trying to put forth initiatives, bringing in catastrophe modelers like my company, insurance companies, trying to bring in different technologies and thought leadership to help small communities think about their resilience issues. I'll go over the guy in the blue hat. Oh, yeah. No, you in the blue hat. Yes.
All right. This is similar to what Doug was talking about, but I just want to set up a hypothetical situation. I'm living in California. I have fire insurance, but I don't have earthquake insurance. There's a minor earthquake, not big, but it's enough that it knocked over my neighbor's space heater. His house catches fire, and mine catches fire. Am I covered or not?
I think so, because you are covered for fire, and we do, for our earthquake models, this is always where I get confused. It's like the coverage versus what we model. In our models, we do account for fire damage following an event, because we don't want to double count that damage. So if a home turned into rubble and then it caught on fire, you're not getting paid out twice. You're getting paid out once. But I think you would be covered because you're covered for home fire, even if, and that includes wildfire.
And even weirder, if you get hit by a tsunami and you have earthquake insurance, doesn't cover you.
Right.
Flood insurance
That's flood coverage. Yep. Yeah, go with you.
There are two things that insurance companies don't like to pay for, and that's acts of God and terrorism.
Yes.
That was one of the problems with 9/11 was terrorism. And there were insurance companies that didn't want to pay. Now, I don't know all the details of what went on to it. But the one thing that I find is very interesting is down in South Miami, Florida, they're being inundated with salt water. The people are buying and selling the land as if nothing is happening, total denial. And the town there is actually raising the roads so they don't get flooded as often. And it's like, at what point are the people going to say we want claims or whether they are covered or not?
Yeah, Florida's very interesting like that. And so there are some theories about sea level rise in Florida that they're building up so much mitigation along the coastline in that area that that's going to kind of block out the wave heights coming in, but sea level rise is going to be more impactful by water coming in through the Everglades. So coming in through western Florida, that instead of coming along the coastline, it's going to come in the backside. And so there's a lot of issues there. Should people put their homes on stilts? Should they just get out? Raising the roads, that seems like that could be problematic, because if you think about some images from Hurricane Harvey, you have these houses on like these little hills and the roads are all covered in water. In this case, it would be the exact opposite. Your roads are clear, but your houses are underwater. So I'm not too familiar with that circumstance, but that is definitely thinking about sea level rise and impacts from that. Like I have clients that come to me and they ask me, I want to see different scenarios for sea level rise. Insurance companies are looking into doing these analyses. They are considering it because they want to know what the future situations could be. But then again, they do write out for like residential, their policies are 1 year. They're not really writing 5-year or 10-year policies. In some cases they are for like building construction. Like if you're building a skyscraper, that's going to be a multi-year policy. But for residential, it's not.
I think we should stop there. So another round of applause for Megan.
Thank you.